Hi, it's Jo from Minerva. Today we're going to do our sew along of the Mabel Tiered Dress. That's a girl's dress from the Liberty Pattern House, and we're going to use Liberty fabric with the Liberty pattern. I'll take you through the techniques needed for the neck binding and for making view E, which is an elasticated sleeve. I'll be following the pattern as you would if you'd bought the pattern and you were going through each step. The pattern is the Liberty Mabel Tiered Dress, and it starts from 6 months up to age 4, and it's got various sleeve options. It's got an elasticated sleeve, sleeveless, a flutterby sleeve, which is the one that's shown on the front cover, and one that has a sleeve and then with the gathered flute on the end. There's 2 skirt types, so there's a tiered skirt and a plain skirt. There's also a hat that goes with this pattern, so this sewing kit includes interfacing so that you can make the little sun hat that goes with it as well. The kit has fabric and all the notions that you need. The fabric that I've chosen is a Liberty print. This Liberty print is a little bit unusual. It's got a sort of looks like slightly sort of Aboriginal dot painting sort of look, and I've chosen this fabric because the person I'm making this dress for is a redhead, and so I liked the peachy tones, the grey and that green colour. If you've never used Liberty lawn before, you'll be amazed at the smoothness of the touch of it. It's okay to make a dress for children with this, especially a gathered style, because it won't be see-through. If you're making a dress for an adult, you might want to line it with an acetate lining or a light cotton lining, because it is slightly sheer, but it makes beautiful blouses, shirts, tops, summer skirts, really nice pyjamas, very lightweight summer pyjamas. So this is the fabric that we're using today. In the kit you will also get some elastic, because I'm making view E, which has an elasticated sleeve. Out of the pattern, that was the one that I thought showed a skill that you might want to see happening on the screen, so I've chosen the elasticated sleeve, so you'll need some to go in the sleeve. The neck is round here, isn't faced, it uses a binding, so there's binding in the kit. And also if you make the sleeveless version, you use the same technique binding the armhole as you do the neck, so you'll see that technique on today's video. Zip for the back. That's a dress zip, not an invisible zip, so I'll show you how to put that in. And there's also a piece of satin ribbon to tie around the waist, which makes a really pretty dress. Everything that I use will be listed below. You can hover over one of those items and all the items will go to the basket if you want, and then you can delete as necessary. Obviously you can choose any lawn fabric, it doesn't have to be a Liberty one. You could choose a cotton poplin. You could make a cord one, you could make the sleeveless version as a baby cord one and wear it with a t-shirt underneath. So there's lots of different options. Today I'm going to make aged 4, but the pattern goes from 6 months, 12 months to 3 and 4. So it's a dress for toddlers and girls up to age 4. If you're familiar with using the big 4 patterns, then a Liberty Fabrics pattern will throw up no surprises for you. It's really similar in its contents. It has a tissue paper pattern for you to cut your pieces from, and it has instructions laid out very similar to Simplicity, New Look, Butterick, Burda patterns, where it takes you through the instructions with some diagrams to help you. I'm making view E. So I've got a skirt front and a skirt back, and they're both cut on the fold. That's what these arrows are here. I've got the lower tier, the ruffled tier, that's cut on the fold as well, and I need 2 of those. There's a front and a back. The front is cut on the fold, the back isn't, so that you can put the dress zip in. And you need to choose the right sleeve, so this is sleeve E. Before you start sewing, it's a good idea just to use a little test piece of the fabric to find out if your needle is okay, because cotton lawn is really fine. Sometimes a needle can be too thick and make skip stitches, so just check that the needle on your machine is going to make a nice stitch. Just check you don't need to change the tension. Mine's sewing on both sides. And when I open it, I'm getting a join without showing the stitches. So if you need to change your needle, load up with some Gutterman thread and you're ready to go. I'm going to assume you've sewn before, but I'll try and not skip bits and take you through as many things as possible. So before I take my pattern pieces off, I have marked the notches. Some people cut a V sticking out. I cut mine going in. Some people mark it with chalk. There's a couple of other markings to make as well. And then I can take my fabric off the paper pieces. And number 1 on the pattern instructions is to stay stitch round the neckline. So where the neckline pieces are, we're going to put a row of stitching inside the seam allowance so that it doesn't stretch out, and it actually stops it stretching out even through washes and after it's being worn. So we're going to stay stitch the neckline and join the shoulders. So this is stay stitching, look. It's just a row of stitching through a single layer of fabric, and now it's stopped that weave moving. Next is to match the notches on the shoulders and the side seams, and we're going to sew across there. The seam allowance is 1.5, and it's important that you keep that throughout so that the size of the garment is correct at the end and that all pieces fit inside each other. If you're sewing children's garments, I find it really useful to keep cutting the threads as I go, because it's such a small garment that the little bits get in the way and then you sew them into a part of the garment you don't need to. So try and keep quite tidy when you're making children's things, because it's small, everything's very close together. I didn't used to have sewing machine scissors by my sewing machine, but they're so great. You can clip curves with them, you can snip threads, you can do little cuts without making that mistake of going through your stitch line. So a little pair of hand sewing machine scissors are fabulous. Okay, a 1.5 seam allowance, and then finish the raw edges. Stitch forwards and back at the end of each row. And that will help secure your fabric when you're handling it. And for every seam, I will go over to the iron and press. And you need to press as you go along, especially with children's clothes, because the seams are so short and small that by the time you've got the neck binding on there and the sleeve on there, you're never going to get the iron to get that shoulder seam really nice and flat. So it's important that you keep your threads out of the way and you press as you go along. And that's the bodice. That's step 1 and 2. Just be mindful of which view you're doing. So now you're going to skip some stages. So this is sleeves A and B. This is sleeve C and D. So now we're going to skip to item 10, which is sleeve E. So make sure you're not just following it sequentially, you're actually selecting the parts of the instructions that you need. Item 10 is the sleeve. So if you've not worked with sleeves before you take the pattern piece off, you need to mark a notch. 1 notch is the front armhole, and 2 notches is the back of the armhole. And there will also be the centre point of the sleeve I'm going to gather between notch and 2 notches, and I've got my machine on a straight stitch and I've got it on stitch length 5. That's the longest that it goes, and that means that I can make a gathering line within the seam allowance, and it will already start to gather up. Need some nice long tails, okay, like this, and then we're going to pull those. If you put one line of gathering threads in, you'll get like little folds rather than gathers. So now you need to put the second line of gathering in, still within the seam allowance if you can, and keep the tails out of the way, because you're going to want those clear to pull, and if they're caught up in the stitching you won't be able to pull them so easily. So the second row of gathering stitches goes in, keeping the end tails out of the way. And then you're going to use the bobbin threads to pull up. So I've sewn from the right side, so I know the bobbin threads are on the wrong side. I'm going to collect the two threads and hold them together, and then gently, rather than pull the threads, I'm going to try and slide the fabric along the threads rather than pulling the threads. If you pull the threads really hard, they'll snap and you'll have to start again. So it's best to try and move the material along the thread tram line, and you should get this beautiful gathering if you use 2 rows of gathering stitches. To press the underarm seam, because it's a small circumference, and of course if you're making the 6 months or 12 months it'll be even smaller, I'm using a sleeve board, or you might have a sleeve roll that you can get that tight seam on there. I'm going to narrow hem around the bottom, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, I've got my 2 sleeves. I'm not sure of the gather yet, so I've pulled one a bit tight and I've left one. I haven't snipped my gathering threads off because I'm going to need those, but I have snipped all of my side threads off this underarm, so that I don't get confused and start pulling the wrong one. So I've got a really tidy end here and here, and then I've got all my gathering threads here. I'm going to make a narrow hem. This is part of steps 10 we're still on, and I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to fold over a really small hem just once. We're going to put that through the machine, then we're going to trim it and fold it over again and sew it again, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, if you can take this part of your machine off, will make your plate narrower. That really helps. And I'm going to fold over a really small fold. I'm going to actually measure it to show you. Oh, it's like 4 mil. And then I'm going to sew 4 mil all the way around the sleeve. And then I'm going to trim off any excess. I mean, I might not have any excess, so I'm making it as small as I possibly can. So the first pass through the machine has now got a raw edge. So I've done it very small, I don't need to trim it, but if you were new to it and you turned it over a bit much, you could trim it. And now I'm going to fold it again. So from the right side, I'll have 1 row of stitching, and from the wrong side, I'm going to try my best to sew on top of that line, or it doesn't matter if I go off it because it'll be on the inside, but that's how you get a really narrow hem. And then we'll have our row of gathering, so that we need a narrow hem because we need that hem to gather up, and if it was thick then it would be too bulky. And I'll show you. I'm going to just keep my ends out of the way. I did forwards and backwards on both passes. So now the right side has one line of stitching, and on the wrong side I've got one line, and in some places, oh, just there, look, I've just gone off the line a little bit, but that's on the inside. And that's a really good hemming technique for pyjama bottoms, if you don't want a big thick hem, sleeves, cuffs, like if you've made like a frill cuff, because you will see the inside of it, so you don't want a really big thick hem. Okay, time to move on to the next stage. Okay, stage 11 is quite fiddly, so I'm going to try and show you. There should be some markings. I've only got little dots, I might join them up in a minute, which is the casing line. So off the pattern there was a straight line here that you needed to transfer onto your fabric, called the casing line. It was actually, for me, about 3.5 centimetres up from my hem. I've marked it all the way around, and then I'm going to use the bias binding to make a casing on the inside of the arm. So I'm going to fold the end under so that it's got a smooth end, and then I'm going to line that up with the casing line. So pin the lower edge of the bias tape to the sleeve along the casing line. So we're going to put the bottom of the bias tape on there, and then we're going to stitch really close to the edge. So you need some good machine skills. If you prefer to tack it on, that's not a problem either. And you're going to keep following this bias tape along the casing line. And then when that gathers, this piece here that's left over will be the bit that gathers, and this smooth tape will be against the child's arm. Again, I'm going to take off the front part of my machine so that I can work this around the circumference of here, and I've pinned it, I haven't tacked it, and I'm going to get as close as I can to the edge, and I'm going to actually turn my machine speed down. I can change the speed of my machine, and I'm going to go really, really slowly. Like that, slowly. Okay, so the sleeve casings are inserted with that nice neat finish there, where I can get the safety pin in. And I'm just going to refer back to the paper pattern because there is a sleeve elastic guide. Now, if you've got a child, I suggest you put the elastic around their arms so that you can test, or you can use the sleeve elastic guide, which is to cut the elastic using the sleeve guide here, non-stretched, and that will give you a guide length for a 4-year-old. Got a really small safety pin because I need it to go through that narrow casing. I'm going to put the elastic onto the safety pin and then feed that into the opening, making sure that the elastic stays nice and flat. And just so the elastic doesn't ping back through, I'm going to put a safety pin on the end and keep moving the safety pin along to take the elastic in through the casing. And you can see how we're getting the frilled sleeve edge. Step 13 is to secure that little gap with a bit of a slip stitch so that you can't see the elastic. And to stop the elastic twisting, you can also sew through all of those layers here and here along that underarm seam, and that will stop the elastic twisting. You get a frilled edge sleeve. It's a really nice technique. You could use it on a t-shirt. So if you had a t-shirt that's got a longer sleeve, or if you had a long sleeve t-shirt, you want to make it into a short sleeve one, you can put a piece of bias binding on the inside and thread it with elastic, and then you will get this gathered edge. To the end of the sleeve stage, then you will have to go back to step 9, and step 9 shows you how to insert the sleeves. So it's where all of the notches that you marked really become useful, because then you can spread the fullness of this gathered sleeve into the area of the sleeve armhole. So I'm going to change the camera angle so that you can see where I'm placing each part. So you need to start with the right side of the sleeve facing out. The underarm seam is there, and that's our first pin. I'm going to have the pins with the glass head on the sleeve hole, because that means I won't scratch myself when I'm sewing. The next points to look for are the little V notches that I cut out. So that's my next pin. And then I'm going to go and look for the double cutout notch on the other side. And that's how I know that I've got the back and the front in the right place. So I haven't got my sleeve in backwards. So those are the first 3 pins: underarm, front notch, double back notch. And then there was a marking which was marked on the pattern with a dot for the top of the sleeve head, and I marked that with a little snip, which I will find in a moment. There it is. So the next one to mark is the top of the sleeve head, and then I'm going to look for the next one, which was marked with a little dot again, and there's a dot on the bodice. So it's helping us to distribute the fullness by putting these main points in. And there's the one on this side. And at the moment we've got too much flapping about on the gather side, but we're going to use the gathering threads to pull that fullness in. So first of all, I'm going to mark all the main points, and then we're going to use the gathering threads to get rid of this excess. Okay, I'm just pulling up those gathering threads so that the fabric is the same circumference as the armhole. And this is why it's important to make sure you've got rid of all the threads from other sewing processes, because otherwise there's too many threads and then you can't see which ones you're pulling. So it's hard enough with the 4 gathering threads at each end, so you need to make sure that you haven't got any other ones from the side seam or hanging around in the way. And now if it was an adult armhole, I would probably just put that straight under the machine, but because it's such a small circumference, I'm going to tack that so that I don't get stabbed and it doesn't move around, and then I can sew 1.5 from the edge and make sure that I'm taking in the fullness of the sleeve. It's easier to sew the sleeve from the inside so that you keep all of the rest of the sleeve in the air out of the way. And also you want to be able to see the gathering side so that you can adjust any gathers or look for any obvious folds. So you're sewing on the inside of a circle. It's a really useful thing to know when you're sewing a really small circumference. only got gathers showing there now, not any that have folded themselves over under the machine foot. And that's what your sleeve should look like. Should have those puff gathers along the top, but evenly distributed. It is so pretty. And then on the inside, you might want to just clip these curves so that child's got plenty of movement. And again, this is where the super scissors come in. You don't want to snip into your stitch line. If any of your gathering stitches from the first stage are just peeping through onto the right side, there, look, mine are just there, can you see? Then you can take those out because they're not holding the gather now, your new stitch line is, so you can take those out. You can pull out any of those gathering stitches. There we go. And that will actually release the arm as well a little bit more. Perfect. We're now going to start the skirt sections, which for view E start at step 20. But again, you're going to have to choose which skirt you're on. So whether you're on skirt A, B, C, D, E. So it depends which design that you've decided on. So the first thing is to make sure you've got all your notches marked before you take off the paper, because we've got to ease in a lot of gathering. So those notches are going to be crucial. And then we are going to sew up the back seam. Okay, this is the back seam, and the zip's going to go in there. And then we're going to put the skirt front right sides together onto the skirt back. There are notches at the side to match up. We're going to sew the side seams and then start the skirt gathering. Okay, on the back, so that's the back open seam, there's a little notch, and we're going to sew a gathering stitch all the way around the top of the skirt piece back to the notch on the other side. And it's advisable to stop your gathers as you go over your side seam, otherwise you'll get quite a bulky lump there. So see how your machine behaves. You might be able to get away with it, but if you're getting like a funny lump here, it's because you need to stop your gather and then start your gather again on the other side. Make sure it's the upper edge of your skirt piece that you gather. So you're going to gather all the way around here, back to the zip openings. You've got the zip opening here and the gathers across the top. Now it's time to make sure you've got all the notches marked on the ruffle pieces, and then we're going to sew the ruffle ends together to make one big tube shape that's going to go on the lower tier. Step 21 is to join the ruffle ends together and gather with 2 rows of gathering the upper edge. You'll know it's the upper edge because it's the one with the notches in, because you want to make sure that you get your pattern the right way up, because although it's very busy, it does have a right way and a wrong way. And now we're going to repeat the technique that we use for a narrow hem on the hem of this skirt. So we're going to hem the skirt before it's all attached together, and it's quite a useful tip that if you're making tiered skirts, because once you've got the weight of a tiered skirt to try and get under your sewing machine, it sometimes sort of drags and pulls one way. So while it's a light piece, we're going to hem the skirt in the same way that we hem the sleeves, folding over, sew once, turn again, sew on the second pass. So step 22 is to add the tier to the edge of the skirt. So make sure you're putting the lower tier of the skirt that's the one that's not gathered, onto the gathered one, the hemmed edge, the gather, the skirt, and then the waist gather will be here. Waist gather, tier gather, hem. Okay, so you've got the ruffle attached to the skirt, the gap at the back for the zip, and then you've got your gathering stitches running along the top, and that's what's going to attach onto your bodice. So for all views now, whichever one that you chose, we're now going to move on to number 23, and we're going to attach the skirt to the bodice. The gather's a bit tighter on the waistband, so you're going to need to pull it more than the tiers, and you're going to be pulling the bobbin threads. I've pulled them from one end where the zip is, and then I can measure using the notches, so I know that that side seam matches up with that side seam. I can pin it, and then I can see how much of that gather to adjust along here. So I've got quite a bit there, not so much there. So when I finish going all the way around, I can readjust that, but I've got the right length between the two. And then I've pulled it from the other end. So rather than pulling the gathering threads all from one end, I've sort of worked out where the middle is, and I've pulled from one end and adjusted them to here, and then I've pulled from the other end and pulled them to here. It sort of helps to distribute them a bit more evenly. And you'll need to find the center point of your skirt, and there's some notches along this edge that you can find. There's one, and that's how you get the gather distribution. So between the side seam and the first notch, I've got plenty of gather in there. It's not even yet, but I know that I've matched up the length. And then I'm going to keep going over to the other side and doing it side to side to side. And you know, we might have to take a few pins out and readjust it, but this is the front line of the skirt, the main waistline, so we want it to be right. And gathering does take just that little bit more time, but that's why you get a special dress. Step 25 is to finish the neckline. So you're going to get the bias binding and line it up with the edge of the neck, pin it on. Your first pass through the machine is going to be 1 centimetre from the edge, and then you're going to flip the binding over and it will make a small facing on the other side. It's a great skill to have. It's brilliant if you're making adult garments and you haven't quite got enough fabric to make facings. You can use bias binding instead of having full facings. And if you're making the sleeveless version from this pattern, you will be using this same technique around the armholes. So I'm going to pin that on, and I'm going to show you each stage of it so you know what to look out for. A 1 centimetre seam allowance doesn't follow the fold of the bias binding. It's a little bit further in. On my machine it happens to be if I run the foot along the raw edge, so that's helpful for me. Next you press the tape and the seam away from the garment, so you press everything out, and then you're going to understitch. So you're going to understitch very close to the bias here, and you're going to be catching your trim seam allowance from behind. And it's quite precision work. You want to make sure that you're right on the edge. and you're keeping the seam allowance here. This needs to be coming up here so that your stitch line will be through all of that. You don't want that to flop down, you want to keep that pressing up. Final part of the neckband is to fold the neckband to the inside and pin. It's up to you. I like to sew mine from the reverse because I like to use the bias as my kind of measure, or you can sew it from the right side, and then you will have one row of stitching on the outside and you'll have that little tape running around the inside. The last stage is number 28, and that is to put the zip in. It asks you to adjust the length of the zip if you need to. I'm making age 4, so I don't need to. I'm going to tack up the back length of the dress. So I've matched the tops, I've matched the waist seam, and it goes down to that notch that I sewed to, and I'm going to tack that, press it open, and then I can center my zip on that tacking line, and then I'm going to tack it in place. I mean, there's no quick way to put a zip in. Once is the fastest way to put a zip in. You don't want to be doing it more than once. So I'll show you each stage. It's not necessarily the one described in the sew along instructions there. That says to tack 6mm edges, which you can do. I just like to have this center tack seam as well, which holds everything in place. Okay, I've machine tacked down that center line. I've used a 5mm gathering stitch, so it's an easy stitch to pull out at the end. But now I've got a line that I can put my zipper teeth down. So I'm going to be following the line down the center here that I've just made, and my zipper teeth are going to run along there all the way down, and so I can pin them in place, pin the teeth on top of the seam line, and then I can tack it in place, and then I can sew it, because then nothing's going to move. The zip's not going to move, the seam's not going to peel open, and then I end up with like a little bit more covered than another. So I'm going to pin that all the way along here, and then I'm going to tack it in place with a hand tack, and then I'm going to sew it under the sewing machine. When it's tacked in place, you should have no pins to get in the way under your machine. You'll have an even little fabric overlap on either side of your zip. It's all tacked in place. I've just used some large tacking stitches, and now I can sew from the right side using a zipper foot, and I can make sure that I have the same overlap on both sides. It's really important, and this is a bit of a thing that I learned over time, not to go down your zip across the bottom and back up the other end, because you'll wonder why it will do this. It will pull up on one side, because if you go down one side and up another, you pull the fabric weave down this way, and as the foot drags up that side, you'll pull the weave up the other way. So then you'll wonder how you started with a perfectly lovely even top, and then you will get a top that goes like that. So sew each zip in the same direction. Once I got sewing, I realised it's actually better to go from the bottom to the neck, because my neck hole, whilst all tacked together, isn't very big for manoeuvring under the sewing machine. So if you go from the tiered bottom up to the top, and from the tiered bottom up to the top, you're still taking the zip in the same direction without pulling one weave against another. The zip's in. I'm going to take out all of the tacking, so I'm going to take out my hand tacking, which is in the dark purple, and that was holding the zip in place. And then I'm going to use an unpicker to run down the center of the zip. You just need to take out the stitch line that you originally put in. You can take your time to do that because you don't want to at the last minute catch the fabric when you're down here. And you can see how by tacking it all together everything stayed in place. So the waistline seam has stayed in place and the top neck has stayed in place, and so has the bottom. Okay, that's it. I shall give you a little show in a minute. I'm just going to pull all my little threads out and tidy up any other little loose threads. I might just put a little hook and eye at the top of there. So here it is finished. You've got the tiers, the gathered sleeves, the zip and the binding, and it's all really neat. You could also put ties on it if you wanted to, so you could use the ribbon from the kit to either add ribbon ties, or you can put the ribbon band on top around the back, and you could maybe explore some of the other sleeve pattern options, which I will show you now. Because I think if you saw that pattern packet from the front and that big flouncy sleeve wasn't your thing, you might not sort of think to choose the pattern, but actually there's a lot of different sleeve options there. There's one with a flounce, one with a longer sleeve, tiers. There's the sleeves that I did, which is E. There's a sleeveless one, so you could make that to wear in autumn or winter. And there's also a little hat pattern, which I'm going to try soon. Even if you're not ready for making a summer dress right now, it's a good idea to click a kit and put it in your saves. So if you're a craft club member, you might want to take advantage of one of the season's special offers, and then you know where that kit is, and you can make collections in your saves of fabrics, patterns and kits. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've been inspired to try either some Liberty fabric or pop the Mabel Tiered Dress into your saves for a sewing kit for the future. And if you have any questions, please leave them below and I can try and answer them for you. See you again soon.